The mountains stand on both sides of the valley, and the cold coming off them has already decided what this winter will be. At the base of a stone cliff above Prickly Pear Creek, a 19-year-old girl drives a wooden stake into frozen ground with her bare hands. She has $8, a dead father's axe, and a plan that no one in Helena believes will survive the first frost. The company's sign is already there, 20 feet away. Fresh-cut wood, the paint still sharp. She looks at it once. Then she picks up the next sapling and keeps working. What she is building has never been built here before. 3 chambers cut into living rock, curved walls of woven willow and clay that will hold warmth through 22 below zero. But someone else knows what's hidden in that hillside, and he's already on his way. Gunnar did not look at her when he told her to go. He was sitting at the kitchen table when Britta came through the back door with an armload of split kindling from the yard. He had his hands flat on the wood, looking at the grain of it, the stillness of a man who had already rehearsed the hard conversation so many times that the actual version felt to him nearly finished. She set the kindling down beside the stove. She said, "What?" He said, "I've made arrangements. Mrs. Halverson on Clark Street. She needs a domestic, room and board included. Good work." He paused. "You should go tonight. Pack what you need. The rest I'll keep for you." She looked at him. She said, "Tonight," he said, "the sooner the better." She said, "My father has been dead for 2 months." He said nothing. She said, 2 months, and you want me gone tonight." He looked up, just briefly, then back down at the wood grain. She understood then, not the details, the shape of it. She had been reading shapes since she was 14, and her mother died, and adults started making decisions about her future without consulting her. The shape of a thing announced itself before the details did. This shape was he had already been paid. She said, "How much did Fitch give you?" He said, "Britta." She said, "How much?" He looked at her, the face of a man who had made a decision under pressure and convinced himself it was the right one and had lived with it long enough to believe it, but who was finding now that it had to be spoken, that it felt different said than thought. He said, "There's a debt. Been a debt for a while. The company through Fitch offered to clear it in exchange for finding a reliable domestic for the Halverson household." He paused. "I told them you were reliable, and you are. It's good work, better than you'd find on your own." She stood in the kitchen of her dead father's brother's house and looked at this man who had her father's hands and her father's chin and none of her father's character. She said, "You didn't ask me." He said, "I knew you'd say no." She said, "So you just decided." He said nothing. She went upstairs. The room she'd slept in for 2 months had a rope bed and a single west-facing window and a small chest. She opened the chest. She packed methodically. 1 woolen dress, 1 spare skirt, 2 pairs of stockings, her mother's bone comb that had come over from Sweden inside a boot in 1869, the small tin box with the $8 in it. She'd been saving for 2 years from laundry work she did for the women on 5th Street. $3 a month when there was work, less when there wasn't. $8. She picked up the tin and held it for a moment. The weight of 2 years of Monday mornings with other women's sheets in a galvanized tub. She put it in the canvas bag. She came back downstairs. Gunnar was still at the table. She went to the back door where her father's axe leaned against the wall. He'd brought it from Sweden in 1869. She'd watched him use it for 11 years before he died. The handle worn smooth from the grip of his hands, the oils of his palms worked into the grain over 20 years. She picked it up. Gunnar said, "Britta." Mrs. Halverson is known to be a fair employer. You'd be warm and fed through winter. That's not nothing. She said, no. He said, you don't have other options right now. She said, I have $8 and my father's axe. He said, that won't get you through a Montana winter. She looked at him. She said, it might. She went out. The September evening was going dark at the edges. Helena sat in the valley with the mountains behind it and the smell of pine sap and coal smoke coming off the houses. She walked south along the back lane with the canvas bag on her shoulder and the axe in her right hand, and she did not look back at the house. She walked until the last of Helena fell behind her. Then she turned off the main road and went to the livery stable on the south end of town. The owner had gone home for supper. She went around to the back to the hay storage room she'd passed before when she'd brought a horse in for reshoeing. She cleared a space in the hay. She lay down with the canvas bag as a pillow and the axe along her side. She did not expect to sleep, but she was 19 and she had spent 2 months grieving her father and doing Gunner's laundry, and she was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been carrying more than their share for longer than they'd admitted. She slept. She woke at some hour after midnight to voices outside the stable door. 2 men, the careful volume of men conducting business they didn't want overheard. She lay still. Through the gap under the door, she could see the edge of a lantern's light, the shadows of 2 people. One of them was Gunnar. She knew his voice the way you knew the voices of people you'd lived with, the hesitation in it, the way he started sentences and then gathered himself. The other had the even unhurried tone of a man who conducted this kind of business regularly and found it unremarkable. She listened. The transaction was simple. Gunnar had told Fitch she would report to the Halverson household in the morning. Fitch had paid him a debt settlement against what was owed to the company store. All arranged. The Halverson household needed a reliable domestic. The company needed Gunnar's debt cleared on the books. Britta was the mechanism by which both things happened. Nobody had asked her. She lay in the hay and listened until they were done. When the lantern moved away and Gunnar's footsteps went back toward the house, she lay still for a long time. She thought about her father, not the accident, not July, just the man who had come to Montana because the mining companies were hiring Scandinavians who knew hard rock and cold winters, who had spent 6 years going down into the Cresswell mine every morning with his lunch pail and coming back up every evening with the tiredness of a man spending himself at a rate he couldn't quite afford. He would have known what to do here. He always knew, not in the loud way of men who talked about knowing, in the quiet way of men who had seen enough problems to understand that most of them had solutions if you looked at them straight. She thought he would not go to Mrs. Halverson's. She got up before the light came. She walked south. The road out of town followed Prickly Pear Creek, and she followed the road until the last buildings fell away, and then she left the road and followed the creek itself. Cottonwoods along the bank, their leaves going yellow at the edges, water low and clear in the September morning light, mountains on both sides of the valley. Her father had said once, start with water. Everything else follows from water. He'd been kneeling beside a stream in a Swedish forest when he said it, showing her the difference between cold, clean, moving water and the stagnant kind. She'd been 8. She hadn't known why he was telling her. She knew now. She walked for an hour, maybe more. The light came up slowly gray to silver to pale gold. The valley narrowed south of town. The creek cut deeper into the hillside. Stone cliffs appeared on the west bank, rising from the water tan and gray sandstone. that had been here longer than anything else in the valley. She watched them as she walked, looking for what her father had taught her to look for: irregularities, places where the landscape hadn't decided to be the same as everywhere else. She found them. 3 alcoves cut into the base of the cliff, natural formations. The rock had cracked and shifted at some point in the deep past, some geological argument about fault lines, and the result was 3 spaces in the stone face, each roughly 10 or 11 feet across, 6 to 8 feet deep. The ceilings curved from the cliff toward the opening following the line of the fractured rock. She stopped. She looked at them, her father's voice clear in her head. Look twice. First look, what is it? Second look, what could it be? First look, 3 holes in a cliff, empty. Open to the east, creek below, ponderosa pine above on the ridge, wind from the north and west deflected by the cliff behind. She walked to the nearest alcove and went inside. The temperature change was immediate, not dramatic, real. The cliff face and the curved ceiling deflected the morning wind. She pressed both palms flat against the back wall. Cold, deep, stable cold, the kind carried up from far below the surface. Not warm, but consistent. It would not go much colder in February than it was today. She walked to the second alcove, wider, 12 feet across. The back wall curved more smoothly, following a cleaner fracture line, level floor, better for sleeping, better for a hearth. Third alcove, smaller, 8 feet wide, a fissure in the back rock where water seeped from the hillside above. She touched it with one finger, cold, steady, a deep seep fed from water that had been underground long enough to equilibrate to the rock's own temperature. She stood in the third alcove and looked at all 3. She thought about what her father had described, once talking about the farm buildings in Dalarna where his grandfather had been born. Not the houses, the outbuildings, the ones that had outlasted the houses because they worked with the slope instead of against it. First alcove, wood storage, 4 cords of split timber kept completely dry. The curved roof would shed rain and snow above the flood line. Second alcove, living quarters, a hearth, clay walls for thermal mass, 1 fire in the evening, 48 degrees without fire at all. Third alcove, food storage, the seep for humidity, the rock temperature for cold storage, vegetables through to March. 3 alcoves, 1 system. She was still thinking when she heard the boots, a man coming down the bank above through the brush, not bothering to move quietly. She stepped back into the shadows of the first alcove and watched. He came down the slope and stopped 20 feet from where she stood. He was carrying a wooden stake and a hammer. He looked at the alcoves with the mild acknowledgement of someone who hadn't expected a person here and was not concerned about it. He drove the stake into the ground in front of the first alcove, nailed to the top a painted board. Cresswell Mineral Claim number 7. He picked up his tools and walked back up the bank and headed north without a word. She stood and looked at the sign. She thought Cresswell and Company had been filing claims along Prickly Pear Creek for 2 years. Everyone knew it. The kind of thing people discuss the way they discuss weather. Large, indifferent, moving through the landscape. This stake was fresh cut this morning. The timing could be coincidence, or it could be routine. A company staking a long claim boundary would send one man with multiple stakes on a single morning. This had not been placed because she was here. This had been placed because someone had decided, probably months ago, that this section of creek was worth claiming, which meant she had walked into a problem that already existed. Her father used to say the only problems worth solving are the ones that were already there when you arrived. Problems made specifically for you are usually designed so you can't win them. Problems that exist before you get there have already been working without you and have a shape you can learn. She looked at the sign. She put it in the back room. She set her canvas bag against the first alcove wall. She set the axe beside it. She went to find Willow. The creek bank south of the alcoves held what she needed: young cottonwood and willow green and flexible, nothing over 4 inches across. She walked slowly, touching trunks as she passed, the way her father had walked a forest before cutting anything. She needed saplings about 14 feet long and as thick as her wrist. She identified 12 and marked them in her memory. She needed a buck saw. She walked back to Helena. The livery stable owner was in now. She offered 2 hours mucking stalls in exchange for the buck saw for the day. He looked at her for a moment. Then he handed her the saw and pointed at the stall row. She mucked. She took the saw. She went back to the creek. The cutting went fast. She'd done this before, or something close to it, in the hills above Gable when she was 12 and her father was building a curved fence around a natural spring. He'd shown her how to check the grain by bending the tip slightly. Too stiff and it would crack under load. Too flexible and it wouldn't hold its shape. Green wood bends, dead wood breaks. The curve you force into living timber today becomes permanent tomorrow if you do it right. She heard his voice so clearly it stopped her, right there on the creek bank with the buck saw in her hand and the September light going gold through the cottonwood canopy. She stood still for a moment, listening to the silence where his voice had been. Then she picked up the next sapling and kept cutting. She carried the 12 saplings back in 2 trips. By noon, she had her first stake driven. By mid-afternoon, she had the first arch in place. One end buried 18 inches deep on the left side of the first alcove's mouth. The sapling bent overhead in a long, smooth arc. The other end buried deep on the right, anchored with wire salvaged from a broken fence post, a perfect semicircle, like the ceiling of the barn in Dalarna, where she and her father had sheltered from a summer storm when she was 9, listening to rain on old wood and eating the bread her mother had packed. She did it 11 more times. By the time the light faded, all 12 arches stood in a row, their curves identical, their spacing even, the whole framework looking like the skeleton of something half buried and half alive. She slept under a canvas tarp that night. Temperature dropped to 39 degrees. She woke twice. The second time she stayed awake lying on her back, looking up at the stars between the cottonwood branches. The Cresswell sign stood 20 feet away in the dark. She knew exactly where it was. She put it in the back room, closed the door. What was in front of her was willow. Hundreds of thin, flexible shoots, each 6 to 8 feet long. Tomorrow she would weave them through the arches, over, under, the same pattern her mother's mother had used making baskets in Sweden. Pattern and architecture were the same thing at a different scale. This was what her father meant when he said, "Look at how things are made, not just what they are." She closed her eyes. She thought he taught me everything I'm about to do. He hadn't known that was what he was doing. He'd just been a father who knew things and had a daughter who paid attention. She slept. The root of the first decision was this: she was not going to think about the sign. Not yet. Because thinking about the sign meant thinking about what it meant, and what it meant was a problem she couldn't solve with her hands. So she set it aside the way her father had taught her to set aside problems that weren't ready to be solved. You put them in a back room, you close the door, the problem doesn't go anywhere, but neither do you until you've finished what's in front of you. What was in front of her was willow. She'd spent the first morning scouting the creek bank south of the alcoves, identifying the right stands. Young cottonwood and willow, nothing over 4 inches across, green enough to bend. She needed 12 saplings, each about 14 feet long, each the thickness of her wrist. She needed them cut clean, stripped of side branches, and carried back before they started to stiffen. She borrowed a bucksaw from the livery stable in exchange for 2 hours mucking stalls. The stable owner, a quiet man named Draper, who had the permanently squinting expression of someone who'd spent 40 years looking into wind, handed her the saw without a word and pointed at the stall row. She mucked. She took the saw. She went back to the creek. The cutting went fast. She'd done it before, in the hills above Gavel, when she was 12, and her father was building a fence that needed to curve around a natural spring. He'd shown her how to select for straightness in the trunk, how to check the grain by bending the tip slightly and feeling for resistance. Too stiff, and it would crack under load. Too flexible, and it wouldn't hold its shape. Green wood bends. Dead wood breaks. The curve you force into living timber today becomes permanent tomorrow. She heard his voice so clearly it startled her, right there on the creek bank with the bucksaw in her hand and the September light going gold through the cottonwood canopy. She stood still for a moment, just listening to the silence where his voice had been. Then she picked up the next sapling and kept cutting. The first arch went in that afternoon. She drove 2 stakes into the ground at the alcove's opening exactly 11 feet apart. Then she took the first sapling, buried one end 18 inches deep on the left side, and bent it overhead in a long, smooth arc, pressing down with her whole body weight until the tip reached the right stake, and anchored it there with wire she'd salvaged from a broken fence post. The sapling formed a perfect semicircle, just like a wagon cover rib, just like the ceiling of that barn in Dalarna where she and her father had sheltered from a summer storm when she was 9, listening to rain on old wood and eating the bread her mother had packed. She did it 11 more times, spacing each arch 16 inches apart, adjusting the depth of each anchor stake to compensate for the natural lean of the hillside, working methodically from the outside in. By the time the light faded, all 12 arches stood in a row, their curves identical, their spacing, even the whole framework looking like the skeleton of something half buried and half alive. She slept that night under a canvas tarp stretched between 2 cottonwood trunks. The temperature dropped to 39 degrees. She woke twice. The second time, she didn't go back to sleep, but lay looking up through the canvas at the stars between the branches and thought about the sign, Cresswell Mineral Claim Number 7. She'd seen those signs before, on the hills above Helena, on the creek flats east of town. Cresswell and Company had been filing claims aggressively for 2 years. Everyone knew it. Everyone talked about it the way they talked about weather, something large and indifferent moving through the landscape. You didn't argue with it. You moved around it or you got swept up. She was apparently not moving around it. So she closed her eyes and listened to the creek below and thought about her father's back room. Problem goes in. Door closes. She tried to close the door. It didn't close all the way. Day 2 was the weaving. She'd saved the longest willow shoots from yesterday's cutting, hundreds of them, each 6 to 8 feet long and slender enough to flex without snapping. Starting at ground level, she wove them horizontally through the vertical arches, over, under, pulling each strand tight before moving to the next. It was slow. It was exact. It was the kind of work that required complete attention and gave nothing back except itself, which was the kind of work she'd always liked best. By noon, she had 2 feet of lattice wall. By mid-afternoon, 3 feet. By dusk, 4.5. The wall curved from the rock face on both sides and was already starting to close, the opening narrowing the rectangle of sky visible through the mouth of the first alcove to a long, bright slot. She stood back and looked at it in the last light. It looked wrong. That was always how it looked in the middle. Her father had told her that too. The middle of anything always looked wrong because you were too close to it to see what it was becoming. She went back to her tarp. Day 3, she finished the first wall. Day 4, Wei Song. She didn't hear him coming. She was on her knees in front of the second alcove, pressing test areas of the rock face to check for moisture seepage, when she became aware of a pair of boots standing 10 feet to her left. She looked up. A man, 40, maybe 45, Chinese, dressed for travel with a pack frame on his back and the expression of someone who had seen a great deal and was in the habit of watching carefully before deciding what he thought about any of it. He looked at the first alcove, at the finished wall, at the framework of arches she'd begun on the second opening. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he walked away. She went back to checking the rock face. Day 5. He came back. Same time, same quiet approach. But this time he had something in his hand. A piece of folded cloth stiff with wax, the kind you use to protect drawings from moisture. He unfolded it carefully and held it out. A drawing, done in pencil on the inside of the cloth, cross sections and elevations, dimensions marked in 2 different measurement systems side by side, and running along the bottom, a sequence of 6 small diagrams showing wall construction in stages. She took it, studied it. His English was careful, deliberate, like someone who had learned it later in life by paying close attention to how other people used it. He said, "The outer wall you have built is good for storage." She said, "That's what it's for." He said, "If you want to live in the second chamber through a Montana winter, the outer wall is not enough." She looked up at him. He said, "You need a second layer inside. Clay mixed with chaff packed to 6 inches. The mass absorbs heat during the day and releases it at night. You need only a small fire in the evening to maintain comfort. Northern China has used this method for 500 years. She looked back at the drawing. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because you are building it almost right, and it would be a waste to build it only almost right." A pause. She said, "What do you want for it?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "Nobody gives away useful knowledge for nothing." He looked at her with something that might have been amusement and might have been something else. He said, "I have been hauling freight across this territory for 11 years. I have watched people build structures that failed in the first winter because they built what they knew instead of looking at what was in front of them. You are looking at what is in front of you. That is not common. I would like to see it done right." She held the drawing for a long moment. Her father would have trusted this. She could feel it, the quality of trust he'd extended to people who spoke simply and directly about things they actually knew. He'd been wrong about people sometimes, but not often. She said, "I don't have enough cash for the materials to build a second layer." Wei Song said, "I know a man at the freight yard who has chaff he needs to dispose of, and the creek clay is free. What you don't have is my help carrying clay from the upstream deposit, which I offer if you want it." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "All right." They worked. She had not worked alongside another person since her father died. It was strange how quickly the rhythm established itself. Wei Song carried clay in buckets from the deposit 200 yards upstream while she mixed it with dried grass and the chaff he brought from the freight yard and water from the creek. The ratio had to be right. Too wet and the mixture wouldn't pack. Too dry and it would crack when it hardened. She found the right consistency by feel, the same way her father had taught her to find it. Wei Song watched her hands. He said, "You've worked with clay before." She said, "My father." He said, "In Sweden." She said, "Yes." He nodded once and picked up another bucket. They didn't talk much after that, but the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that existed between people who were focused on the same problem and didn't need to fill the air to prove they were present. She packed the inner layer starting from the floor and working up, 6 inches thick. She pressed it in sections, overlapping each new section with the previous one, smoothing the joins with wet fingers. The wall was becoming something substantial, something that would take the cold and hold it back. By the end of the second day working together, the inner layer of the first alcove was complete and beginning to harden. Wei Song looked at it. He said, "That will hold." She said, "If it doesn't crack." He said, "It won't crack. The chaff holds the clay matrix together through the freeze-thaw cycle. Same principle as the wattle walls in the mountain villages of Shanxi. Different materials, same physics." She looked at the wall. She thought, "If this works, I have a place to sleep that won't kill me." She thought, "If this works, I have something to give people." She didn't know where that second thought came from, but it stayed with her. The bark roof took 2 more days. Ponderosa pine on the ridge above the alcoves, thick plate bark peeling off in sections 2 feet long and 14 inches wide. She collected 69 pieces, climbing until her palms were sticky with pitch and her shoulders burned. Each piece got overlapped like shingles over the arched framework, secured with bent willow pins. The bark followed the curve of the structure. Rain would hit it and run off. Snow would slide right over. She stood on the ground below and looked up at it. It looked like something that had grown there. Now for the third alcove. The food storage chamber was different. She needed stable humidity and a temperature that wouldn't freeze but wouldn't warm enough to rot. The solution was the creek itself, or more precisely, a portion of it. She cut a channel 18 inches wide through the hillside bank, lined it with flat stones, and directed a thin flow of water into the back of the third alcove through a gap she left at floor level in the clay wall. The water would evaporate slowly into the enclosed space. The evaporation would keep the humidity consistent. The deep rock would keep the temperature stable. Her father had described something like this once, talking about the root cellars of his childhood in Dalarna, the way the best ones use natural water seepage to regulate conditions rather than fighting them. The principle worked or it didn't. She sealed the water channel edges, packed the floor with gravel for drainage, built a simple wooden rack from trimmed branches, tested the temperature by pressing her palm flat against the rock at the back. Cold, not freezing, about what she needed. She was on the outside of the third alcove, checking the bark roof attachment on October 3rd when the storm came. Not snow, not yet. Cold rain, the advance guard of what the winter would send later. It fell for 36 hours. The temperature dropped to 34 degrees. Wind came off the mountains in long gusts that leaned the cottonwood trees sideways and sent loose branches spinning down the creek. She sat inside the second alcove. The clay walls were still curing, but already solid. The bark roof shed water in continuous sheets off both sides of the arch. The inner clay layer held the ambient temperature at 48 degrees without any fire at all. She could feel the difference the moment she stepped inside, the way the cold stopped at the wall and didn't come through. She listened to the rain. She thought about Fitch, not with fear, with the clear-eyed calculation of someone who had accepted a situation and was working out what came next. Because Fitch was coming, she knew it the way she knew weather now, by the quality of the air before it arrived. The storm would pass, and then something else would arrive, and she already had a sense of its shape. She built a small fire in the stone hearth she'd constructed in the second alcove, ate the last of the cornbread she'd traded 3 hours of laundry work to get, drank creek water from the tin cup that had been her father's. Outside, the rain was doing what rain did, coming down without opinion or intention, indifferent to everything below. She was not indifferent. She was 19 years old, and she had built something that was working. That was all. That was everything. Fitch came the afternoon after the storm cleared. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of a man who expected paths to accommodate him rather than the other way around, brush pushed aside rather than navigated boots, landing harder than necessary on the wet ground. He came around the slope of the hill and stopped. He looked at the 3 alcoves. He looked at the Cresswell sign, which was still standing. He looked at the alcoves again. His face did the thing that faces did when a person was recalculating something they'd already decided. The recalculation was small, but it was there. She stood outside the first alcove and waited. He said Cresswell's woodshed came down in the storm. She said I heard the wind. He said 4 cords of winter wood in the mud. She said, I'm sorry to hear that. He looked at the first alcove, at the curved roof, at the bark shingles, at the wall with its clay surface smooth and water dark from the rain. He said, how much water got in? She said, none. He didn't answer that. He walked to the first alcove and put his hand on the clay wall. He pressed. He checked the roof edge where the bark met the rock face. He crouched and looked at the floor. Dry. He stood up and looked at her with the expression of a man who had underestimated something and was trying to decide how much to show about it. He said, I want to make you a proposal. She said, all right. He said, Cresswell and Company has 12 structures that need to be built before the first hard freeze. Storage and shelter for workers at 3 different sites. What you've built here, the materials costs, and the performance, that's something the company would want. He paused. He said, you teach the technique to our construction crew. In exchange, you stay on this land through the winter. No trespass action. $2 a week. Firewood from company stock. She looked at him. She said, you want the technique? He said, yes. She said, not the person who knows it. He said, I beg your pardon. She said, once your crew learns the technique, you don't need me anymore. So what happens to my claim on this land in the spring? What happens to the trespass action? You've got what you wanted, and I'm back where I started. Except now, it's spring, and the ground is thawed, and I'm easier to move. Fitch was quiet for a moment. He said, that's a very suspicious way of looking at a fair offer. She said, is it wrong? He didn't answer right away. And the fact that he didn't answer right away was its own kind of answer. She said, I'll stay on this land. I'll do it within whatever legal framework actually applies here. But I'm not trading my knowledge for a winter's grace period and a promise that stops being convenient in April. Fitch looked at her for a long time. He had the eyes of a man who had been doing this kind of business for 30 years, assessing, calculating, looking for the angle. He said, I'll be in contact with you again. She said, I'll be here. He walked back the way he'd come, boots landing the same as before, but she noticed he was moving more carefully around the brush on the way out. She went back inside the second alcove and sat by the cold hearth. Her heart was going faster than she wanted it to. Not from fear, from something else, the feeling of having said a true thing out loud and not being sure yet what it cost. There would be a cost. There was always a cost for saying the true thing. She'd known that since she was 12, watching her father come home from the mine with the tiredness that wasn't physical, the tiredness of a man who had kept his mouth shut all day about things that needed saying. She'd asked him once why he didn't say them. He'd looked at her and then said, "Because I have you to feed Britta." And that was the end of that conversation. She sat in the alcove and tried to decide if she felt like she'd done something brave or something stupid. She decided it was probably both, possibly neither. She decided she didn't know yet, and that was fine. She built a fire and made coffee. Pastor Hook came 3 days later. He was a tall man with the upright bearing of someone who had decided long ago that physical posture was a form of moral argument. He picked his way carefully down the creek bank in his good black coat, holding it away from the brush, and stopped a polite distance from the alcove entrance. He said her name first, which was how he always started. Like naming something was the beginning of owning it. He said, "Britta, I've been concerned about your situation." She said, "I appreciate that, Pastor." He said, "I want you to know that I've taken steps to ensure you're not left without options." Something cold moved through her. Not quite surprise, more like recognition. She said, "What steps?" He said, "I wrote to the Cresswell office last week to explain your situation, that you're a young woman alone, that you're occupying company land without legal standing, and that you need to be brought into a proper arrangement before winter hardens." He paused. His expression was sincere, genuinely, completely sincere. He said, "I've spoken with Mrs. Halverson on Clark Street. She needs a domestic. The work is respectable and the room is heated. It would see you through to spring." She looked at him. He said, "Pride can be a temptation, Britta, especially for the young. The life you've built here, it's impressive in its way, but it's not sustainable, and it draws attention that a young woman alone cannot afford." She said, "Who else have you written to?" He said, "I've notified the county land office of the situation as well, just to ensure everything is properly documented." She said, "You reported me to the county." He said, "I documented the situation for your protection." She said, "For my protection." He said, "So that when the matter is resolved, you have a clean record, no unauthorized occupation, no trespass violation. If we act now before the company presses the issue formally, you walk away with nothing against you and a position waiting." She stood there and looked at the man in his good black coat, standing in front of something she'd built with her hands over 17 days, explaining to her that he had reported her to the county land office for her protection. Gunner, she thought. That was Gunner's logic. The same grammar of help that wasn't help. The same certainty that the person being helped had no standing to define what help looked like. She said, "Pastor, I'm grateful for your concern." She said, "I'll need to think about what you've told me." He nodded, relieved. He'd expected more resistance. He thought thinking it over meant considering his offer. She let him think that. She walked him back to the creek path and watched him pick his way up the bank, holding his coat, moving carefully in his good shoes. A man doing what he believed was right, with the certainty of someone who had never had to question whether what he believed was right. She waited until he was out of sight. Then she went back into the second alcove and sat down on the floor with her back against the clay wall and her knees drawn up, and she let herself feel it, all of it, the weight of what the past 3 weeks had accumulated. Gunner, Fitch, Huck, 3 different men, 3 different reasons, 3 versions of the same offer dressed in different clothes. Be manageable, be small, be in a category we recognize. The fire had burned down to coals. She didn't rebuild it. She sat in the half-dark and let the wall hold the temperature and thought about her father. Not the lessons, not the techniques, just him. The actual man who had been alive and then wasn't, who had eaten breakfast the morning of the accident, the same breakfast he always ate, the same chair he always sat in, who had walked out the door with his lunch pail and his tired eyes. She had a feeling about those last weeks that she hadn't let herself examine directly. Something had changed in him in the 2 weeks before July. He'd come home different, not tired in the usual way, quieter than his usual quiet, eating quickly and going to bed, not talking the way they usually talked in the evenings. She'd filed it away as exhaustion, as the specific weight of a long season underground. Now sitting in the alcove with the coals going dark, she wasn't sure. She was not sure what she'd seen in him in those last 2 weeks. She only knew it wasn't the ordinary kind of tired. She stayed on the floor until the coals went fully dark. Then she got up, rebuilt the fire, sat in the growing warmth, and thought about the Cresswell sign. Front room problem now. The back room door was open because Hawk had written to the county and Fitch was coming back, and the sign was still there, and she had 17 days of work and 3 functioning alcoves and $2.40 and the knowledge of something that worked. She thought about what came next. She thought if she could build this for herself in 17 days for under $10, what could she build for someone who had less than that? She didn't know yet who that person was. She just knew they were out there because she had been out there 17 days ago, standing in front of Gunner's door with a canvas bag and $8 and no clear direction. The fire was warm now. She leaned her head back against the clay wall and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would figure out the money. Tomorrow she would think about the county office and what Hoek had actually set in motion. Tomorrow she would keep building. But tonight she let the wall hold the temperature, and she thought about her father's last weeks and the quality of silence that had been different from his usual silence, and she let herself feel that too, without trying to put it in the back room. Some things were too large for back rooms. Some things you just had to sit with until they became the right size for carrying. Ingrid Dahl arrived on a Tuesday in late October with 3 children, a canvas sack, and a pregnancy that was 8 months along and done with pretending otherwise. Britta saw them coming down the creek path from 100 yards away, the woman moving carefully, the children arranged around her in the geometry of children who had learned that staying close mattered. The oldest one, a boy, was carrying a bundle almost as big as himself. The middle one, a girl, was holding his hand. The youngest was being carried on Ingrid's hip, on the side away from the belly, in the careful adjustment of a woman who had been making that calculation for months. Britta set down the willow she'd been prepping for a repair on the 3rd alcove. She stood and waited. Ingrid stopped 10 feet away. She looked at the 3 alcoves, at the clay walls and the bark roofs and the creek below, at the Cresswell sign, which was still standing, which Britta had stopped looking at directly, because looking at it directly was not useful. She looked at Britta. She said, "You're Anders Strand's daughter." Britta said, "Yes." She said, "My husband worked the same level as your father, Eric Dahl. He's been gone since July." A pause. Britta said, "I'm sorry." Ingrid said, "So am I." She set the youngest child down carefully. The child leaned against her leg and looked at Britta with the flat assessment of a 2-year-old who had recently learned that new places required new decisions about trust. Ingrid said, "The company gave us 30 days in the Lancer housing after he died. 30 days and then the room was needed." She said it without anger, the way you said facts that had already been processed. They came out flat because everything that could be felt about them had already been felt. Someone from the church told me you were down here, that you might know something about staying through winter without money. Britta looked at her, at the belly, at the 3 children, at the single canvas sack that contained everything this family had. She said, "How far along?" Ingrid said, 8 months, give or take. The creek moved below them. The cottonwoods had gone fully bare in the last week, and the light came through differently without the leaves, sharper. Britta said, "I have a second alcove. It's warmer than outside and drier than anywhere you've been recently, and it holds 48 degrees without a fire going." She paused. "I also have more firewood than one person needs through winter, and I have work I can't do alone." Ingrid said, "What kind of work?" Britta said, "Stacking, carrying, learning." She looked at the 3 children. "All of them can do at least one of those." Ingrid said, "I can pay when the baby comes and I'm back on my feet." Britta said, "You can pay now. In the work. We'll call it even as we go." Ingrid looked at her for a long moment, the look of a woman deciding whether to trust something, not naive trust, the beginning of earned trust. She said, "All right," she said, "his name was Eric. In case you were wondering." Britta said, "I know. My father talked about him." Neither of them said anything for a while, because some things didn't need more words, because the 2 of them standing on a creek bank in late October with 4 cords of dry wood and 3 alcoves and no money and a combined total of 4 children, between them one of them not yet born, was already its own kind of statement. Britta showed them the second alcove first. The 2 older children went immediately to the back wall and pressed their hands against the clay, the way children tested new surfaces, with complete commitment and no self-consciousness. The boy said, "It's warm." Britta said, "It holds what the rock holds. The rock holds yesterday's sun." He looked at the wall, thinking about that. She said, "Your name?" He said, "Peter." She said, "How old?" He said, 7. She said, "You're big enough to stack a cord of wood if someone shows you how." He looked at her with the expression of a child who had been waiting for someone to say that for his entire 7 years. The girl said, "I'm Astrid. I'm 5. Can I stack too?" Britta said, "You can carry the kindling." Astrid said, "Is that important?" Britta said, "Ask me in February." The youngest was named Lars, after his father. He was 2 and had no opinions about wood stacking, but he had strong opinions about the water channel in the 3rd alcove, which he attempted to access 3 separate times in the first hour. Ingrid watched all of this from just inside the 2nd alcove entrance, her hand on the clay wall, not pressing it, just resting her palm against it, the way you rested your hand against something you were deciding whether to believe in. She said, "How did you build this?" Britta said, "My father taught me. He didn't know he was teaching me, but he did." Ingrid said, "Where is he now?" Britta said, "Same place as Eric, the same mine, the same level, the same July." Ingrid's hands stayed on the wall. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "We're gonna be all right here." It wasn't a question. It was the way she was deciding to understand the situation. The only way to understand situations when you didn't have the luxury of waiting to see. Britta said, yes. They fell into a routine in 3 days. Petter and Astrid came to the woodpile each morning after breakfast. Britta showed them the stacking pattern, larger logs on the outside, smaller splits in the middle. Everything angled slightly, so moisture drained down and away. Petter was methodical. Astrid was fast and not always accurate and had to be redirected frequently, but she remembered corrections the first time they were given. Wei Song came twice in the first week after Ingrid arrived. He brought clay and he looked at the arrangement of 5 people in 2 alcoves with the careful neutrality he brought to everything, and he said nothing about it except that the clay work in the second alcove needed a small repair on the lower left section near the entrance where the ground frost had moved the foundation slightly. Britta fixed it that afternoon. On the 4th day, Ingrid was unpacking the canvas sack, sorting what was worth keeping from what was worth trading, and she found it at the bottom. She found it the way you found things that had been put somewhere deliberately by someone who expected to deal with them later and then ran out of later. A piece of folded paper, heavy the weight of a government document, stiff with age, one corner dark with what might have been water damage. She held it without opening it for a moment. Then she looked at Britta. She said, "Eric kept this. He didn't tell me what it was. He put it in the bottom of the sack 2 weeks before the accident, and he told me to keep it somewhere safe and not to ask him about it yet." She held it out. Britta took it. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was good quality official weight. The creases were sharp, which meant it had been folded more than once. It was a survey map. She could read survey maps. Her father had been a miner, and miners' children learned to read the documents that governed where the men went and what they came back from. She'd been looking at survey maps since she was 10. This one was dated 1873, a grid layout of the Prickly Pear Creek drainage with claim boundaries drawn in ink and the names of the claimants noted in small, neat script beside each parcel. She found Cresswell Mineral Claim Number 7. She found its marked boundaries. She measured the distance with her eye. The Cresswell claim ended 60 feet south of where the Cresswell sign was standing. 60 feet. She was building on public land. She had been building on public land from the first hour. The sign was wrong. The boundaries Fitch had asserted were wrong, not by error. 60 feet was not a surveying mistake. 60 feet was a decision. She stood completely still. She thought this is why Fitch wanted her gone quickly and quietly rather than pressing formal trespass. She thought because he knew. She folded the map along its original creases. She said, "Where did Eric get this?" Ingrid said he worked in the records room for 3 weeks last spring, filling in when the regular clerk was sick. She paused. "He never told me what he found there. He just put that paper in the bottom of the sack." Britta looked at the folded map in her hand. She said, "Did he tell anyone else?" Ingrid said, "I don't know." She looked at the map. "Is it important?" Britta said, "Yes." She said, "Give me a moment." She went outside and sat on the rock in front of the first alcove and held the map in both hands and let herself think. The creek was low. The cold had slowed it in the past week. A winter sound, a sound of things conserving themselves. She thought about what she had. A survey map showing Cresswell had filed claim boundaries 60 feet beyond the actual survey line, which meant everything Fitch had said to her was based on an assertion the company knew was false, which meant the trespass threat was never real, which meant she had been negotiating against pressure that had no legal standing. She also thought about what she didn't have: a lawyer, money for a lawyer, time for a legal process that would run through winter and into spring, and during which Fitch would have every opportunity to make things worse for 12 families before any ruling came down. She thought about the 12 families. She'd been watching them for 6 weeks. The mine workers' families who lived in the company housing on the flat above Helena, who bought their food from the company store, who had no woodsheds because the company supplied their fuel, and no root cellars because the company supplied their food, and no skills to build anything because the company had structured their lives so that the skills of self-sufficiency had nowhere to grow. Her father had been one of them for 6 years. She thought about that. She went back inside. She said to Ingrid, "There's something I need to ask you." Ingrid looked up from the stocking she was mending. The children were asleep. The fire was low. She said, "Ask." Britta said, "The accident in July, the column that fell." Ingrid's hands went still on the stocking. Britta said, "Did Eric say anything about the structure?" Before it happened, a long quiet. The fire moved. Ingrid said, "He came home 3 weeks before, and he was different. I knew something was wrong. He said there was a column on the 4th level showing a crack. He'd reported it to the shift supervisor. The supervisor told him it was within tolerance." Britta said, "Did he believe that?" Ingrid said, "No. She said he went back and measured it himself. He'd worked in a Swedish mine before he came here, and he knew what tolerance looked like. He said this was past it." She said he went to Fitch. Britta went very still. Ingrid said he told Fitch the column needed shoring before the next blast. Fitch told him the repair would cost 2 days of production, and the schedule didn't have 2 days. He told Eric that the structural assessment was the engineer's responsibility, and Eric was a miner, not an engineer, and he should do his job. She paused. She said 2 weeks later, and then she stopped, because the rest of it didn't need to be said. Britta sat on the floor. She looked at the clay wall. So that was it. That was what had changed in her father in those last 2 weeks. That was what she'd seen and filed away as exhaustion. He'd known. He'd gone back anyway, because Ingrid's husband had gone to Fitch, and Fitch had said 2 days of production, and Anders Strand had a daughter to feed and a rent to pay and no other job within 40 miles that would have him at his age. He hadn't had a choice. None of them had. And Fitch had known that, had counted on that, had looked at men with no other options and decided the column could wait, because where would they go? She sat with that for a very long time. The last morning her father left for the mine. He'd stopped at the door, turned back, looked at her. She'd been half asleep at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm. She'd looked up. He'd been standing in the doorway with his lunch pail and his coat and the set of his jaw that she'd always read as stubbornness. She'd raised her hand. He'd nodded. He'd gone. She'd gone back to her tea. She sat in the alcove and thought about that wave, how casual it had been, how she'd had no idea it was the last one, which was, she decided, the only mercy in all of it, that she hadn't known, that she'd waved like it was ordinary, because it had been ordinary, and now she knew what it had cost him to make it look that way. She stayed on the floor until the coals went dark. Then she got up. She said to Ingrid, "There's something else I need to ask you." Ingrid put down the stocking. Britta said, "If I can build these 3 alcoves in 17 days for under $10, what do you think I can do for 12 families in 6 weeks?" Ingrid said, "Before winter sets in hard." Britta said, "Before winter sets in hard." Ingrid looked at the clay walls, at the bark roof, at the fire that was keeping all 5 of them warm on a night that was 28 degrees outside. She said, "I think you could change what's possible for 12 families." Britta said, "Yes, but if I spend 6 weeks teaching instead of fighting, Fitch doesn't face consequences. Not right away." Ingrid said, "And if you fight instead," Britta said, 12 families might not have anywhere to go while the fight is happening, and fights take longer than winters." Ingrid was quiet. The fire. She said Eric kept that map because he thought it was leverage. Britta said, "It is leverage." Ingrid said, but not the kind you pull right now. Britta said, no, another quiet. Ingrid said, the 12 families first, then the map. Britta said, the map goes anonymously, no names. Ingrid said, so Fitch never knows. Britta said, so nobody gets squeezed while the county sorts it out. Ingrid picked up the stocking again. She said Eric would have understood that. He wasn't a patient man, but he knew the difference between a fight you could win and a fight you were right to have. Britta looked at the map. She folded it and put it inside her jacket. She said it stays there until spring. She started the next morning. She went to the mine workers' housing on the flat above Helena, and she knocked on the first door, and she asked to speak to the woman of the house, not the man, the woman, because the women were the ones who understood what winter required. The men understood the work. The women understood what happened when the work stopped, or the fuel ran out, or the food went short. The first woman was named Helga. She was 40 and looked 60 and had 4 children and the wariness of someone who had been offered things before and had learned what the offer usually cost. Britta said, I'm not selling anything. I'm not from the company. I'm Anders Strand's daughter, and I've been living on Prickly Pear Creek since September, and I want to show you how to build something your family can use. Helga said, what kind of something? Britta said, the kind that keeps wood dry and food cold and a room warm through February, with 1 small fire at night instead of 3. Helga looked at her. She said, that's a large claim. Britta said, I know. Come see it first, then decide. 3 families came to the alcoves that first week. They walked around the structures and pressed their hands on the clay walls and stood inside the second alcove and felt the temperature and asked questions that Britta answered directly and without overselling. 2 of them started building the following Monday. By the 3rd week of November, she had 6 structures in progress at different sites along the creek and the hillside above the miners' housing. She went from site to site every day, checking the arch spacing, correcting the clay mixture, showing people by doing it herself first and then having them do it while she watched and corrected. Wei Song appeared at 3 of the sites without being asked. He brought tools when tools were needed. He pointed out problems before they became larger ones. He moved from site to site with the same unhurried efficiency. She said to him once, you're not getting paid for this either. He said, I know. She said, why? He said, because in 11 years of hauling freight across this territory, I have watched 3 different communities fail to get through winter because nobody knew what they were doing. And I have watched other communities survive because someone took the time. He paused. He said, your father was one of the people who took the time. I knew him, not well, but enough to know what kind of man he was. She looked at him. She said, you never told me that. He said, I'm telling you now. She turned back to the wall she was working on. She said, he would have liked what we're doing here. Wei Song said, yes, I think he would. Petter and Astrid worked every day. Petter had become genuinely expert at stacking the pattern, so internalized that he did it without thinking, his small hands placing each split in the right position with the precision of someone who had learned a physical skill thoroughly enough to forget they were doing it. Astrid had opinions about everything and was usually right. Lars had decided Britta was interesting and followed her at a distance of approximately 3 feet, watching everything with the total attention of a 2-year-old who had concluded that watching was the fastest way to understand things, which was, she thought, exactly the right conclusion. Ingrid got bigger. She moved differently as November became December, the weight of the pregnancy requiring constant small adjustments. She sat by the fire in the evenings and listened to Britta describe what she was seeing at the different building sites, and she asked questions that were sharp and useful. She was Britta, realized the person she talked to now, the person she thought out loud with, the way she'd never had before, not since her father. One evening, Ingrid said, "You're teaching them the structure, but you're also teaching them something else." Britta said, "What do you mean?" Ingrid said, "I watch how they look at you when you correct something. They're not just learning to mix clay. They're learning that they're capable of building something they didn't think they could build. That's different." Britta thought about that. She said, "My father did that too. He'd show me something, and then he'd hand me the tool and walk away. He said the only way to learn a thing is to have to do it yourself, while someone stands close enough to catch you if you fall." Ingrid said, "Where did he learn that?" Britta said, "I don't know. I should have asked." She said, "I should have asked a lot of things." Ingrid said, "Yes, we all should have." Neither of them said anything for a while. The fire. By December 15th, 10 of the 12 families had functional structures. 2 were still in progress because of ground conditions, and she was working on a modified design for hard soil that used flat stone footings instead of driven stakes. By December 22nd, all 12 were done. The winter came down hard on Christmas Eve, not the October storm. The real thing. 18 below zero the first morning, the kind of cold that found every gap in every wall, the wind that sucked heat from anything built wrong. Ingrid said nothing when the cold came. She sat by the fire with her hands on her belly, and she breathed steadily, and she didn't complain. 2 days after Christmas, before dawn, she woke Britta. She didn't need to say much. Britta understood from the quality of the sound she made and the way she was breathing. It was the hardest thing Britta had done since September. Not because she didn't know what to do. She'd been present for births before farm animals, mostly, and once with a neighbor in Gavel when she was 11 and there was no one else, and her father had sent her in and stood outside in the Swedish winter, listening to know if he needed to come in himself. Hard, because this was not a problem you could solve with your hands. You could only be present for it, which was a different skill, one she was less practiced at. The baby arrived in the very early morning when the cold was at its deepest, and the fire in the hearth was casting the only warmth within 20 feet in any direction, small and loud and immediately certain about her opinions. Outside, it was 22 below zero. Inside the second alcove, it was 48 degrees without running the fire any higher than she would have on an ordinary evening. Ingrid held her daughter. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I'm going to name her Britta." Britta looked at the baby. She said, "You don't have to do that." Ingrid said, "I'm not doing it because I have to." She looked at her daughter. "I'm doing it because when I got here in October, I had 3 children and no place to go and no money and a baby coming and a dead husband. And now it's the coldest night of the winter, and I have 3 children and a new daughter and a warm room and wood to burn until April." She looked at Britta. She said she should have a name that means something. Britta looked at the baby, at the small red face and the closed eyes, and the absolute certainty of her being there. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "My father would have thought that was ridiculous." Ingrid said, "Would he?" Britta said, "He would have said she should be named after someone in the family." Ingrid said, "Well," she looked down, "now she is." January was cold and quiet. She walked to 4 different sites over the first days of the deep freeze and checked every structure. All of them held, not one moisture failure, not one wall crack beyond the minor seasonal ones she'd expected and warned them about. The food storage chambers holding steady, the living chambers staying above 40 degrees. She taught Peter to read survey maps during the cold January weeks. She started with the Helena area maps from the county records office, which she'd visited twice in December, standing at the counter and asking for the survey books in the steady way of someone who expected to be helped. Both times the clerk had helped her, which was what happened when you stood at a counter and expected something without apology. Peter learned fast. He had the kind of spatial intelligence that translated survey grids to landscape instinctively. On a Thursday in late January, she spread the 1873 survey across the floor of the first alcove and showed him the Cresswell claim. She said, "Find the line." He ran his finger along the creek drainage, found the claim boundary, followed it. He said, "It stops here." He pointed. He said, "But the sign is here." He moved his finger 60 feet north. Britta said, "Yes." He said, "That's wrong." She said, "Yes." He said, "By a lot." She said, "Yes." He looked at the map, at the gap between where the line was and where the sign was. He said, "Did they do it on purpose?" She said, "What do you think?" He thought about it for a long time with the serious face of a 7-year-old confronting deliberate wrongness for the first time. He said, "I think if it was an accident, they would have fixed it when they found out." She said, "That's right." He said, "And they didn't fix it." She said, "No." He said, "So." She said, "So." He looked at the map for another moment. He said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "Something that will take a while to work, but that will work." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because the map is the original survey, and the original survey is a legal document, and legal documents don't stop being true just because someone draws a different line on a newer piece of paper." He said, "But someone has to look at both papers at the same time." She said, "Yes." She said, "That's the whole thing." She folded the map. She put it back in her jacket. On a morning in late February, when the temperature came back above 0 for the first time in 3 weeks, she walked to the county land office on Rodney Street with the map inside her jacket. She stood outside for a moment. She thought about Fitch, about the sign, about 5 months of work and 12 families and 3 alcoves and a baby who had come into the world on the coldest night of the year in a room that held 48 degrees because someone had understood what clay and chaff and curved wood could do. She went inside. She did not put her name on anything. She folded the map inside a plain piece of paper with a short handwritten note. The original 1873 survey for Prickly Pear Creek Drainage Section 14 is enclosed. Please compare against the current Cresswell Mineral Claim Number 7 filing. There is a discrepancy of approximately 60 feet at the northern boundary. She left it with the clerk. She walked back to the alcoves. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the way you felt when you'd set something in motion that would take its own time and that you wouldn't see the end of for months, which was fine. She'd gotten good at things that took their own time. Gunner came in April. She heard him on the creek path and knew who it was before she saw him. His footsteps familiar in the way of footsteps you'd heard for years in a house you grew up in, hesitant in a way they hadn't used to be. He came around the bend and stopped. He looked at the 3 alcoves, at the structures that had gone up on the hillside above 6 of them, visible from where he stood, at the creek, at Britta standing outside the first alcove with a bucket in her hand. He looked older than September. She said, "Uncle." He said, "Britta." He looked at the alcoves again. He said, "I heard what you'd built down here." people talk about it in town. She said, people talk. He said, they say you taught half the miners' families how to winter without the company's help. She said, 10 families. Wei Song helped. Ingrid Dahl helped. Petter Dahl is 7 years old and better at stacking wood than most men I've met. He said yes. He reached into his coat. He took out a small cloth pouch. He held it out. She looked at it without taking it. He said, your father's watch. I kept it after he died. I told myself I was keeping it safe. He paused. I kept it too long. I should have given it to you in September. I didn't because I was ashamed to hand you the watch and also hand you out the door in the same morning, and I thought if I kept the watch, I could give it to you later when things were different. He said, I understand if that doesn't make sense. She looked at the pouch. She thought about September, about the canvas bag and the $8 and the lock on the door that she tried twice and the kitchen window and Gunnar in the doorway not quite meeting her eyes. She thought about what it cost to come back. Not money, the other kind of cost. She took the pouch. She opened it. The watch was her father's. She'd known it her whole life. The case worn at the edges from years of pockets. The glass scratch. The hands moving steadily in the way they'd always moved steady, and unsurprised, the way her father had always moved. She held it for a moment. She said, you told Fitch I would take the housekeeping job. He said yes. She said, without asking me. He said yes. She said, to clear a debt. He said yes. He didn't offer more than that. He didn't build defenses around it. He just stood there with the stillness of a man who had decided that the only available position was honesty and was doing his best with it. She said, I know why you did it. She paused, not to excuse it, but I know you were drowning and you made a decision that a drowning man makes, and I was the thing you reach for. He said, that's more generous than I deserve. She said, probably. She closed the watch in her hand. She said, come inside and have coffee. He said, you don't have to do that. She said, I know. She walked to the alcove entrance. She said, I made it strong enough for 5. It'll stretch to 6. He stood there for a moment. Then he followed her in. Wei Song left in early May. He came on a Wednesday morning with his pack frame loaded and his buckets cleaned, and he told her he had a freight run to the eastern settlements that would take him through summer. She said, take one of the drawings. He looked at her. She went inside and got the folded wax cloth with his original drawing and the additional ones she'd added over winter modifications for different soil types, different alcove configurations, notes on clay ratios and chaff sources, and frost line calculations for different elevations. She held it out. He said, these are yours. She said, they're more useful moving than staying. He took the drawings. He said, your father would have been interested in seeing what you built here. She said, I know. She said, I think about what he would say sometimes. He said, what does he say? She thought about her father, about the curves he drew in spilled water on the kitchen table, about the way he handed her a tool and walked away, about the morning of July and the look at the door. She said, he says the curve holds the load, the straight line argues with it. Wei Song looked at the alcoves. He said, he sounds like someone who understood physics and didn't know it. She said, he understood everything and didn't have words for most of it. She paused, which is probably where I got it. Wei Song put the drawings in his pack. He said, the county will rule on the land claim this summer, maybe fall. She said, I know. He said Fitch has already transferred to a different operation. He left last month. She said, I heard. He said nobody announced why. Nobody needed to. She said no. He shouldered his pack. He said, "It's been a good winter to be down here." She said, "It's been a winter." He said, "Yes, that too." He walked up the creek path and turned north toward the Helena Road, and she watched him until the cottonwoods took him. The drawings were moving east now, toward settlements she'd never seen, toward people who would build something with them that she'd never know about. She thought that's how it works. You do the thing you know how to do, in front of someone who is paying attention, and one day the thing you know how to do becomes the thing they know how to do, and you can't separate where your knowledge ends and theirs begins. The Cresswell sign was gone by June. She came out one morning and the stake was lying in the grass 20 feet from where it had been. She didn't know who'd pulled it. She didn't ask. She used it for firewood because firewood was practical, and practical was what she was. Summer came warm to the valley. Petter turned 8. He could now read a survey map as well as she could, and she told him so, and he looked at her with the expression of a child trying to decide whether to believe that, and leaning toward yes. Astrid turned 6 and had opinions about the bark roof repairs that were, Britta had to admit, mostly correct. Little Britta learned to sit up, then stand, then take 3 steps before falling 4 or 5, and then to walk with the confidence of a child who had decided that falling was information rather than failure. Ingrid watched her daughter walk across the packed earth floor of the second alcove one evening in late July, and she said, "She's going to be trouble." Britta said, "Good." Ingrid said, "You think that now." Britta said, "I think that always." Little Britta fell, got up, walked toward the water channel with total commitment. Ingrid intercepted her. Britta looked at the two of them, at the clay walls and the bark roof and the creek outside and the Montana sky going orange above the cottonwoods. She thought about the curve her father had drawn in spilled water on a kitchen table when she was 9, about how she hadn't known it was a lesson, about how she just thought he was thinking out loud, about how the curve was everywhere now, in the walls, in the roofs, in the 12 structures on the hillside above, in a piece of folded wax cloth moving east in Wei Song's pack towards settlements neither of them had ever seen. She thought, you don't know you're teaching. You just do the thing you know how to do. You do it in front of someone who's paying attention, and then one day the thing you know how to do is the thing they know how to do, and you can't separate where your knowledge ends and theirs begins. Which was, she thought exactly right. Which was, she thought the whole thing. Outside the creek moved. The cottonwoods caught the last of the light and held it for a moment in their leaves bright and brief, and then let it go. She watched the light go. Then she went inside where it was warm.